So I have a confession to make. I've been taking smart notes wrong, specifically the process of actually writing the note and the purpose of the note, and rereading and taking rereading how to take smart notes and using it, implementing it in a physical version with actual note cards and figuring out the system that way has taught me a lot of things. And one thing that I want to share in this video is the actual process of writing a note and its purpose. So the biggest takeaway that I had in rereading the book, or one of the many big takeaways that I've had in rereading that book, is the purpose of the permanent note and the only judge of its quality is how well it sets you up for writing future texts. And a lot of that has to do with how well you were able to elaborate on that. And what I've come to understand is elaboration in terms of permanent notes is a two-step process. One is that you've abstracted the idea from its original text, and the other one is that you've abstracted to a way that you can connect it to other things. So it's malleable enough, it's abstracted from the context of whatever material that you took the idea from, so that it can be, that it's atomic, and that it, being atomic makes it so it can be connected and added to other contexts. Because without that abstraction, it's still tied to the previous context, and it can't be moved or merged into other contexts and then combined into writing. And the other part of the permanent note is when you use your own language and you put it in your own words, you actually prepare the note for writing. And I want to give you a contrast between what I thought was a good note prior and what I think is a good note now. So what I thought was a good note prior is this Craftsman's Tool Selection. It's a note from a deep work by Cal Newport. And if you read it, it's more or less a translation. It's a copy. And that's what I want to get to is, yes, I've used my own words here and I didn't copy exactly what word for word that Cal Newport had in his book, but it's so similar that I basically just took it and I changed some of the words and kept the idea the same. I didn't understand yet what it meant to elaborate, to take this from a context and move it into something else so that it could be malleable. And if you look at this, this is 286 words. It took me a good deal of time, probably 30 or something minutes to write this note, which is just far too long for a single individual note. And that's not even the process of like trying to connect it. And I'll leave the findings that I've had and structuring and organizing the slipbox for another video. But this I used to think was a good note. It's, very elaborated on, it's very wordy, and that made me feel like that I had digested the idea enough. But in rewriting it, I want to kind of share some of the notes that I've taken on I think it's the fourth time I've read how to take smart notes, actually. We'll start with multitasking. So here is now an idea that I got from How to Take Smart Notes, and it was the idea of basically that multitasking has no benefits and how we fool ourselves into thinking that they are. And so this in the book is probably 2 or 3 pages to explain the narrative and the argument for it. But people who, multitask fool themselves in 2 ways. They assume that multitasking will improve over time. That's a bias that we have just as human beings, and that the other one is that they never compare themselves to people that aren't multitasking. In today's day and world, finding someone that doesn't multitask is kind of hard to do anyway. And then this was the interesting part and why I bolded it, but multitasking lowers quality and quantity of the work of the individual that the individual can perform. And so this is a completely different note than the other one. The other one, it took his idea and rewrote it in my words, essentially, but this is taking it and in the process of taking the literature note, I took the literature note, and I should pull that up and find that for you here, but in the literature note, I briefly wrote down, I believe it was, multitasking has no benefits. And so now I had that literature note to go and expand on, elaborate on, abstract that idea out from the literature, and came to this permanent note here. And I reference it, so it's on page 57, or 58, if you're curious and have the physical version of that, how I got this, and you can see how close it was if it's not close. But then that sparked a question. This is kind of another lesson that I've learned, and a mistake that I've made is these notes are meant to spark conversation with yourself, to further the research, and instead of trying to build out an elaborate hierarchy of notes. And so another like I was like, why do people multitask if it's, not a good idea? And he kind of goes on to say that, but reminded me of another piece of literature that I read on information overload. And it turns out that multitasking is a reactive strategy that people employ to combat information overload. And so information overload is one excuse or one reason why people might multitask. But now this note, the reason why this is of higher quality than the other one is the other one is basically the writing. It's regurgitating in a little bit what Cal Newport said, but it's so long that it's actually the writing, where the value of the permanent note should be in preparing you to write. So I can now take this and apply it in multiple different contexts. And that's the other part of being atomic, is this single note can be used in many other things to support many other arguments, or to be used in several different pieces of writing. So, an article that I have in mind that I would use this in is Learn to Write Fast, which is a rough draft, kind of just an idea that I have. It's been my focus for the better part of a year, and an essay that I eventually want to write. But this perfectly helps set up the argument for breaking out the different pieces of the writing process. People think that writing is kind of a single process where you sit down on a blank page and you write, but in nonfiction and technical writing, there's research, there's note-taking, there's thinking, there's understanding, there's editing, there's all these different pieces that in SmartNotes he breaks down in great detail, and why SmartNotes is such a great tool for nonfiction, and I will argue for technical writing too. But now this is an atomic idea, or an atomic note that is malleable enough that I can use in different contexts, and that is the reason why it is a higher quality note than the other one, regardless of how many words it is. This one's 94, which is actually more of a lengthy one that I write now. If you want to take a look at some of the notes, to get very meta, we can look at some of the notes on SmartNotes. So here, we'll just look at note-taking as a skill, and we'll look at feedback loops. And so here we have, again, this is about 80 words on that, but again, I tried to take it so it could be used in multiple contexts. So the feedback loop itself, this note's geared towards SmartNotes, but now that it's labeled with feedback loops, I could definitely use this in other writing. Like, what other feedback loops might you get? So again, back to the learn fast, reading is traditionally thought as a linear, but one of the negatives of that, if you just have this one linear process for writing, your feedback comes when the rough draft is done. It doesn't come when you're vetting the idea for the actual article, and SmartNotes is an argument for that, because you can start to see the argument build up before you've kind of committed to a topic. You're letting the interests and your knowledge that's accumulated in notes drive the topics you choose, versus choosing the topic first and just going off and running with it and not knowing how well it is or how interesting the idea might be. So that is what I wanted to share with you today, is the difference between my two notes, and that the number one thing with the permanent notes is really its only metric, in my opinion, and let me know if you disagree in the comments, is how well it prepares you to write. That was the biggest point of friction I had in my previous system here, is I was taking all these great notes and spending a tremendous amount of time on building this elaborate hierarchy, and it wasn't helping my writing. It wasn't getting me any closer to finishing my book. It wasn't helping me sort ideas. It wasn't helping me outline. But in this new way, you can see here in the structure note that the outline is kind of emerging from the way that I'm organizing the notes, and the notes themselves are short enough that I can kind of lay them out if I were to on a tabletop, do that. So if we want to open a workspace, you can see what this might look like. So now, instead of this hierarchy they have to navigate and these super long notes, when I would go to actually look at them to write, just preview all of these, they're short enough that I can read parts or the first sentence or third sentence of something and be reminded and load that information back into working memory as I switch to my editor, which is Ulysses, to write about it. So to reiterate, the number one metric for quality on a permanent note is how well it prepares you for writing. And to do that, it needs to be the result of your own thinking, put in your own words in a concise manner. So what I found really interesting about my old permanent note-taking method and this new one kind of hit me. I was in a conversation with one I was in a conversation while I was walking today, and kind of just hit me as an epiphany as I was rereading The Shallows, How the Internet is Affecting Our Brains by Nicholas Carr. It's one of my favorite books and what started me on this journey. But let me just read this little passage, and it's talking, the context is the chapter is Search and Memory, and it's talking about the difference between artificial memory and human memory, our memory. And it says, while an artificial brain absorbs information and immediately saves it in memory, the human brain continues to process information long after it's received, and the quality of the memory depends on how well the information is processed. Biological memory is alive and computer memory is not. So what was super interesting in the conversation I had today was I had realized that my old note-taking method was overlaying software analogy, how computers save information to disk. They take a copy of it and they put it in a particular folder in a structure so you can get back to it. And that makes sense because a lot of my background is in technology and IT, being a sysadmin of some flavor for a good part of 10 years. It was natural for me, and when I started to take notes and to see this file structure as an opportunity to learn from computers, so to speak, and copy that method where I would find information, take it wholesale, and then I would catalog it for my own usage. Now, what's interesting is I'm unlearning that habit and I'm teaching myself to think for myself, and that is what's creating higher quality permanent notes for me. So if you have a technology background, maybe this will be a similar stumbling block that you'll have. But if you've disagreed with anything that I've said, if you have a different view, I would love to learn more about it. So let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.